All right, so what if like all the systems of government we think about, what if they weren't based on this like, ideal of virtue?
Oh, interesting.
Right. What if they were just based on the very unromantic idea that everybody kind of sucks and they're out for themselves?
Well, it's a very provocative starting point.
Yeah.
And I think it leads us really nicely into thinking about the faux tradition
Right.
in ancient China.
Yeah, so today we are diving into the faux tradition of ancient China, sometimes called legalism, although we'll get to that,
Yeah.
through excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this very topic.
Absolutely.
So our mission, I guess, today is to not just explain this whole body of thought, but really unpack what were the philosophical moves they were making.
Yes.
And like, why should this be something that's interesting to us today?
Exactly.
Right, so to set the scene, we're talking about the Warring States period.
Yes.
453 to 221 BCE is a very competitive time.
Yes, very chaotic.
Lots of upheaval, and I think it's important to know this to understand where these thinkers were coming from.
Absolutely.
Because they were thinking about very concrete problems.
Mm.
It wasn't just like, oh, what is the good?
Yes, it's that
It was
way.
like, how do we make a state that survives?
Yes. Their primary concern was the survival and the strength of the state,
Yeah,
achieving a rich state and a powerful army.
right. And along with that, domestic stability.
Absolutely.
All very pragmatic things.
Right.
So that leads us to, I think, the very core of their thought, which is their view of human nature.
Exactly. And as you said, they were very practical. They were pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't looking at human beings with rose-colored glasses. No.
They thought everybody sucked.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Whether you were a ruler or just a regular person, you're out for yourself.
Exactly.
You're greedy.
Yeah, they thought that human beings across all strata of society were driven by self-interest.
Right.
Primarily the pursuit of material gain.
Right. Fame, riches,
Yeah.
social recognition, all this stuff.
Right. And their whole philosophy wasn't about trying to reform this.
No.
They weren't trying to change human nature. It was about saying, okay, well, given this, how do we work with it?
Right.
How do we construct a system?
Yeah, it's almost like an engineering problem.
Exactly.
Like, given these inputs, how do we get the outputs we want?
Exactly.
And that really shapes their proposed methodology.
Yes.
Right. Because you're not appealing to people's inherent goodness.
You can't rely on a moral compass.
Yeah, you can't rely on virtue.
Or the inherent virtue of people.
Right. So instead, it's about impersonal standards.
Yes, precisely.
Objective standards.
Right.
Not some subjective idea of ethics.
Yes, so I think you could describe it as a shift away from the sort of subjective realm of individual ethics towards a more mechanistic approach.
Right.
They're thinking about laws, administrative regulations.
Right. Very clear rules for everything.
Exactly.
Punishments, promotions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this really, I mean, it provides a fascinating kind of counterpoint to a lot of the philosophical traditions that we are maybe more familiar with.
Yes.
Where, you think about ethical cultivation or the ruler as the moral exemplar.
Right.
Like Plato's philosopher king,
Yeah.
These guys are coming at it from a totally different way.
Absolutely.
And the source really, points to a few interesting underpinnings to their ideas.
Yeah.
Such as their view on historical change and really how they viewed human motivation
Yeah.
as this kind of starkly pragmatic thing.
Absolutely.
So that's what we're going to be unpacking today.
Yeah, so let's start with really defining what is this faith tradition.
Okay.
Because the source points out straight away that there's a problem with calling it legalism.
Okay, so when we hear legalism,
Yeah.
I mean, even the term itself, what jumps to mind is like law,
Yes.
right? A very rigid system of laws,
Yeah.
very codified, much like our modern systems.
Exactly right. A very sort of precise legal framework, which is how we tend to think about law
Yes.
in modern times.
Right. But the source is saying a fa is a bit broader than that.
Yeah, it's much broader, actually.
So what is fa really about?
Well, it does include the concept of law,
Right.
but its meaning is much more extensive.
Okay.
So it can mean standards, it can mean models, norms, methods,
Huh.
and even in some cases, the entirety of the political institutions within a state.
Right. So it's not just the laws. It's like the whole machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if we just equate fa with our modern understanding of law, then we risk missing the point.
Right. We're being too narrow.
Yes, exactly. We're sort of obscuring the broader picture
Right.
of how they viewed statecraft.
Right. So, I mean, how should we think about fa then, if it's not just law?
I think you can think of it as this dynamic system of standards.
Okay.
And it's all aimed towards this idea of effective statecraft.
Right. So again, we're coming back to this very pragmatic.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's not about sort of abstract moral principles. It's
Right.
about
It's about getting things done.
getting things done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so legalism, maybe not the best translation.
No, I think it's quite misleading.
And the source also kind of takes issue with the idea of calling it the phagia,
Yes.
like school.
Right.
So what's wrong with that?
Well, because school implies that it was this self-identified movement,
Right.
like a group of thinkers.
Right, you're a card-carrying member.
Sophagia.
Exactly, of the phagia.
Yeah, that they consciously saw themselves.
Yeah, we're all phagia here.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be how it worked.
No, that's not how it worked at all.
Okay.
The term phagia was really a much later categorization.
Okay.
It was used by imperial librarians
Okay.
who wanted to group together
Okay.
all of these texts.
So it's more of a label that came later.
Exactly.
Okay, so it wasn't a thing at the time.
It wasn't a self-conscious thing.
Right.
No.
All right, so what does the source recommend then?
Well, they recommend using the more neutral term phagia tradition.
Okay.
And this allows us to discuss all of these thinkers
Okay.
together based on their shared ideas.
Right.
Without kind of imposing this artificial structure.
Right, because they may not have seen themselves as a school,
Exactly.
but they had similar ideas, so we can talk about them together.
Okay.
Okay, so we're looking at the fat tradition, not a school, not legalism. So who are some of the people we should think about when we're talking about the fat tradition?
Well, there are several key figures.
Okay.
I think probably the most famous,
Okay.
or the one that's considered to be the culmination of this thought,
Okay.
is Han Fei.
Okay.
And he lived in the 3rd century BCE.
Okay.
And he saw his work as a kind of synthesis and development
Okay.
of
Yeah.
these earlier figures.
Oh,
So people like Sheng Yang,
Okay.
who died in 338 BCE.
Yeah.
And whose policies were very influential in the rise of the Qin state.
Right, he's the guy who's actually like putting this stuff into practice.
Putting it into practice.
Yeah.
And then there's Shen Buhai,
Okay.
who died around 337 BCE.
Okay.
And he was mainly focused on administrative thought.
All right, so those are kind of the big three
Yes, those are the big three.
that we think about.
And then I guess in terms of thinking about how those three were kind of grouped together,
Okay.
the historian Simatian, later on writing about them, noted that all three of them emphasized
Okay.
this principle of singing,
Singing.
Yeah.
Okay.
which is often translated as performance and title, or
okay.
form and name.
All right, so this idea of linking what you're supposed to do with how well you do it.
Exactly.
Okay.
So an official's responsibilities are directly linked with their actual performance.
Well, this becomes a key marker of like, are you in this tradition
Exactly.
or are you not?
It's one of the ways that we can kind of group these thinkers together.
All right, so we have the big three, Shen Yang, Shen Buhai, and Han Fei. And then there's one more important guy that the source mentions.
Yes, and that's Shen Dao.
Shen Dao.
Yes.
Okay, now why is he important?
Well, he lived in the 4th century BCE.
Okay.
And his main focus was on the idea of positional authority.
Okay.
And this idea that authority comes not from your personal virtue,
Right.
but from the position you hold.
Okay.
And this idea was hugely influential
Okay.
on Han Fei,
Oh, yeah.
who in fact dedicates a whole chapter in his work to explaining Shen Dao's ideas.
Okay, so even though we don't have as much from him directly, his ideas are kind of making their way into the tradition through Han Fei.
Exactly. And it's through Han Fei that we really get a sense of his importance.
All right, so big three and then Shen Dao kind of feeding in.
Exactly.
Okay, and actually the source mentions that Sima Tan,
Yes.
who is Sima Qian's father,
Exactly.
he was the first one to use the term Fagia.
Yes.
And he noted that they really focused on these strict and impartial standards. So not just having standards, but applying them fairly across the board.
Exactly. He observed that they were very committed to this idea of applying standards without any regard to personal connections or social standing.
Right.
It's a key element of their thinking.
Yeah, so they're not playing favorites.
Absolutely not.
It's all about what's written down.
Yeah.
Okay, then later on,
Yeah.
during the Han Dynasty, the imperial librarian Lu Xiang formally establish the Phagia
Right.
as one of these categories.
Okay, so it becomes like an official bibliographic category.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so that's how the Phagia kind of comes into being. But remember, that's not a term they would have used themselves.
No.
Okay, so we have a good sense, I think, of like who these thinkers are.
Yeah.
What about the text themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What are we working with here?
Well, we're quite fortunate
Okay.
in that we do have a number of important texts that have survived.
Okay.
Although their textual integrity varies. Okay, so some are better than others.
Some are better than others.
Right.
So I think probably the earliest and most significant work is the Book of Lord Shang, which is attributed to Shang Yang.
Right. So this is the guy who is actually implementing these policies.
Exactly.
So we get a sense of like, what did this actually look like in practice?
Yes, and it's crucial for understanding how these FAIR principles were put into effect.
Okay.
But we have to remember that it's not a unified work.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, scholars generally believe that it's a compilation of various writings.
Okay.
So writings by Shang Yang himself, but also probably by his followers.
Okay.
And these writings were probably produced over a period of time.
Okay, so it's not like he sat down and was like, I'm going to write my manifesto.
Exactly.
It's more like a collection of things.
Exactly. And it's also suffered some damage over time.
Okay.
So some of the chapters have been lost.
Okay, so it's a little bit fragmented.
A little bit fragmented.
Okay.
But despite that, it does present a fairly coherent picture of statecraft.
Okay, so we can still work with it.
We can still work with it.
Right.
And then I think the next really significant work that we have is the Han Feitzi.
Right, the writings of Han Fei.
Exactly. And this is a much more complete and philosophically elaborate work.
Okay.
So the Han Dynasty Imperial Catalog lists 55 chapters.
Okay.
And we still have all of them.
Wow. Okay, so this is a much more complete work.
Complete work.
Okay.
And although there are some debates among scholars about whether every single chapter was written by Han Fei himself, it's generally thought to present a pretty consistent philosophical framework.
Okay, so it all kind of hangs together.
It hangs together.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so the Book of Lord Shang, we have the Han Feitzi. What about the other two guys?
Okay, so Shen Burhai and Shen Dao.
Yeah, what's going on with their texts?
Well, unfortunately, those haven't survived in their entirety.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what we do have are substantial quotations that have been preserved in later encyclopedic works.
So people were quoting them?
People are quoting them, yeah.
Okay.
So scholars have been able to reconstruct.
Okay, so we can kind of piece together what they were saying.
We can piece it together, yeah.
Okay.
And in addition to those quotations, we also have some actual fragmented chapters from the Shenzi.
Right.
Which is Shen Dao's work.
Okay, so we do have at least some bits and pieces of their original work.
Exactly.
Okay. The source also mentions the Guanzi.
Yes.
Where does that fit in?
So the Guanzi is slightly different. It's traditionally attributed to a guy called Guanzong, who was a prominent statesman in the 7th century BCE.
Okay.
But scholars generally agree that the text, as we have it now, was actually compiled much later.
Oh?
Probably between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE.
Okay, so it's kind of falsely attributed.
Yeah, it's a bit misleading.
To this earlier figure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's basically a very heterogeneous collection of essays on various aspects of government.
All right.
And some of these chapters
yeah.
do seem to reflect the core ideas of the Fa tradition.
Okay.
And it was actually later reclassified as belonging to the Fa Jia during the Sui dynasty.
Okay.
Which kind of shows that even though it's a mixed bag, there are some clear overlaps.
Right. People were like, yeah, we can see some connections here.
Yeah.
Even though it wasn't written at the time as part of that.
Exactly.
Okay. So we have kind of our core text that we can draw on.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, I guess, some of the real philosophical ideas behind all this. Because as we've been saying, it's a very practical tradition.
Exactly.
Focused on a rich state and a strong army.
Mm-hmm.
So how do their philosophical ideas lead them towards that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think unlike some other philosophical schools, which are interested in things like metaphysical questions or ethical ideals.
Right, the good life and all that.
Exactly.
These guys are not really concerned about that.
No, they're much more focused on the sort of practicality.
Yeah, the nitty-gritty of like building and maintaining a powerful state.
Exactly.
A state that can defend itself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the source, I think, really picks out two core areas of their thought.
Yes.
That are interesting philosophically.
Yeah.
Their view of historical change and their view of human nature.
Right.
So let's start with their evolutionary view of history.
Okay.
So how did they understand the relationship between the past and the present?
Well, I think their view was actually quite radical for the time.
Okay.
The dominant view.
Yeah.
Was this idea of looking to the past.
Yeah. We should learn from the past.
Learn from the past, particularly the examples of sage kings.
Right.
As a source of wisdom and models for how to govern.
Yeah. Okay. So this idea of historical precedent.
Exactly.
It's important.
But the faith thinkers, they rejected this.
They said no.
Yeah. They didn't think this backward-looking approach was helpful.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. They argued that societies undergo these fundamental transformations over time.
Okay.
And this means that the norms, the institutions, even the values of the past become increasingly irrelevant to the challenges of the present.
It's almost like the past is out of date.
Yeah, it's completely out of date.
Right. The world is different now.
The world's different now.
Okay.
Yeah, so they basically thought that you can't just emulate antiquity.
Okay, so it's not about just going back and being like, oh, the ancients did it this way, we should do it this way.
Exactly.
Right. So this is a pretty radical shift in thinking.
It's a huge shift. It's a very pragmatic view of history.
Yeah.
So they're essentially saying that the past is not a blueprint.
Right.
It's a discarded template.
Right. We're not trying to go back to some golden age or something.
No,
right.
Absolutely not.
We're moving forward.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so for them, effective governance means adapting to the circumstances of the present.
Right.
Not blindly following these outdated models.
Okay, so are there any good examples of them actually articulating this?
Yes. So Sheng Yang, in the Book of Lord Shang, he directly challenges this whole idea of the exemplary past.
Okay.
So he says, former generations did not adopt the same teaching, so which antiquities should one imitate?
Right. So which past are we talking about?
Exactly.
Because every period has been different.
Exactly. And then he goes on to say, the arts and monarchs did not repeat one another, so which rituals should one conform to?
Right. So there's no consistency even in what people did in the past.
Exactly.
So why are we trying to look back to it for guidance?
Exactly. So his conclusion is very clear. Adapt.
Yeah. And Han Fei kind of picks up on this too.
Yeah, Han Fei picks up on this.
And he's particularly skeptical about, like, do we even know what happened in the past?
Yeah. He doesn't think that we can rely on these traditions about the past.
Right. It's all very hazy.
Yeah.
Right.
He thought that a lot of these claims to know the ways of the former kings were based on unreliable traditions.
Right.
And also that they were often used by people to advance their own agendas.
You're kind of cherry-picking the past.
Exactly. You're cherry-picking, you're distorting.
To fit what you're trying to argue now.
Exactly.
Right.
And he famously said that those who openly adduce the former monarchs as evidence are either fools or imposters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's not pulling any punches.
Yeah.
And he also points out the disagreement among those who do invoke the past. They can't even agree.
Yeah, everyone's got their own version.
And everyone's got their own version of what happened.
So it's not really a reliable guide?
Not a reliable guide.
No. Okay, so they're rejecting this backward-looking approach.
Yeah.
So how do they explain then, like, okay, if we're not looking to the past,
right?
How did society develop? How did we get to the state?
Well, they both offer these narratives of societal evolution.
Okay.
Although in slightly different ways.
All right.
So Sheng Yang, he describes this kind of progression from this more primitive communal existence.
Okay, so like small-scale societies.
Yeah.
Right.
Where everyone's kind of undifferentiated.
Right.
And then he describes how this progresses towards a more stratified society.
Okay, so we're getting more complex.
More complex.
More social roles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ultimately, this leads to the formation of the state.
Right.
Which has its own very distinct roles and institutions.
Okay, so it's a very linear progression.
Yes.
For him.
Han Fei, on the other hand.
Okay.
He emphasizes the role of population growth.
Okay.
And scarcity of resources.
All right. So material conditions are important here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And he argues that this is what drives social and political complexity.
Right. So as things get more crowded, there's more competition.
Yes.
And that kind of forces you to come up with new ways of governing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he says that.
Yeah.
This shift in material conditions necessitates a change in how you maintain order.
Okay.
So he says that in the past, when you had small populations, abundant resources.
Right. Everyone's getting along. There's enough to go around.
Yeah. Moral persuasion might have been enough.
Okay.
But as populations grow, you get this competition.
Yeah.
And people's inherent selfishness comes to the fore.
Right.
And in this context, he says moral appeals just aren't enough.
They're not going to cut it.
No.
Okay.
And that's where he says you need laws and regulations.
Right. Backed up by force.
Exactly.
Right.
So the threat of punishment.
Right. So he's not shy about using force.
No, he thinks it's absolutely necessary.
Okay. And this is a pretty materialist view of change, right?
It is very materialist.
It's not about ideas.
Yeah. It's not really about sort of
progress of moral reasoning or anything like that. It's about...
Yeah, it's saying that changes in the material world have a huge impact on social norms.
Right. And how you govern.
And how you govern.
Okay. So we're seeing another example of their pragmatism.
Exactly.
And Shang Yang, I think, also articulates this.
Yeah.
This idea that you adapt to the conditions.
Yeah.
Right.
So he says, when the affairs of the world change, one should implement a different way.
Okay.
And then he gives a very specific example.
Okay.
He says, when the people are ignorant, one can become monarch through knowledge.
Okay.
When the generation is knowledgeable, one can become monarch through force.
So he's really saying, like, look, you got to be flexible.
Absolutely.
You got to adapt to the circumstances.
Yeah, you can't have one rigid way of doing things. It all depends on the conditions.
Okay, so we have this very, I guess, flexible... Dynamic, yeah.
Pragmatic.
View of history.
Yeah.
But the Force also makes a point that they didn't really develop a full-fledged philosophy of history.
That's an important point.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Well, they certainly recognize historical change.
Yeah.
And they theorized about it.
Okay.
But their main concern was with the practical challenges of statecraft in their own time.
So it's not like they're trying to come up with a grand narrative of history.
No, they weren't really interested in doing that.
Or like, okay, what is the end point of history?
Yeah.
Or how does history progress or decline or any of that stuff?
No.
Okay.
Their main concern was, how do we deal with the problems we're facing right now?
Right.
And so their engagement with history was primarily a means to an end.
Right.
It was a way of justifying.
Okay, so it's a tool for them.
It's a tool.
Right, history is just a tool to get done.
Exactly.
What they want to get done.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what they wanted to get done was to implement these radical reforms.
Right, because things are changing.
Things are changing, yeah.
The past is no longer relevant.
Mm-hmm.
We need to adapt to the present.
Absolutely.
All right, so that's their view of history.
Yes.
Let's talk about their view of human nature.
Okay.
Which, as we've kind of hinted at already, is a bit